Good afternoon and welcome to our Missouri Prairie Foundation webinar, Deciphering Botanical Latin with Dr. James Trager. My name is Haley Howard and I am the Outreach and Education Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation. I want to thank you all for joining us for this webinar today and thank our Grow Native sponsors for 2023. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section on your screen, and at the end, I will read those out to James. This webinar is being recorded, and the link will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with resources mentioned during the presentation and Q&A session. And now for some background on James. James is the son of two academic linguists and has been fascinated since childhood by both language and nature. He has a PhD in entomology from the University of Florida, where his specialty was the taxonomy of ants. And as he says, his bills were paid by fire ants. Throughout his series of college degrees, he took nearly as many botany classes as zoology classes and became enthralled with prairies when he visited a prairie remnant with a local flora class in Northern Illinois in 1972, which he helped burn the following late winter. I guess the rest is history. We are so excited to have James here today to share his vast knowledge and experience. And now, James.
Well, hello everybody, and this is really fun. I may not be able to advance my own slides, so you will pardon my periodic next slide, please, and as we go through this talk. So here's my my self-introduction. I sometimes jokingly refer to myself as the son of four linguists because my parents were both university linguists, and the people they married as my step-parents also were. So that's the four, that accounts for the four people. And but I've showed titles from my father and mother, and kind of incidentally was able to do a little tribute to Ukraine. I hope nobody minds. But the irony of this is that my father's parents were actually Russian-speaking Ukrainians from Odessa, and I don't know where they would have fallen on the line of politics, but we won't go there. So maybe I'm going to try to advance this, but if it doesn't work, I'll say next. Okay, next. Somebody there? Whoa, that kind of jumped ahead. Yeah, okay, there we are. Okay, well, here we have a bunch of Romans gathered in the Colosseum. And in those days, Latin was actually spoken in Rome and Pompeii and, generally in Western Italy, what we think of as Western Italy today. There were some related languages that essentially went extinct around that. But these folks are very likely speaking Latin. Next. There we go. I thought there was another slide in between there, but that's all right. This is just an interesting bit of statuary from the 2nd century of the our current, AD or Common Era. It is a sculpture of a pharmacist, who's the woman on the left with the book on her knee, full of her recipes, and that's her assistant in the background grinding herbs. And that just points to the fact that lots of plants were known and used by the Romans and other peoples of the Mediterranean region, the Greeks in particular, as medicinal plants. So we're, some of these names that have come through to the present, in particular the genus names, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, have long ancient roots. And some of them came to mean different plants today than what they meant to the Romans. But the outstanding example that I can think of is our genus Silphium, the rosin weeds and compass plant and so on. And we don't actually know what Silphium was in the Mediterranean that's referred to, which is sort of interesting. Anyway, it was an existing plant name, and we use it today for the rosin weed group. Next. Well, yeah, there was this thing that happened in history. The Roman Empire was spread far and wide beyond Italy. Those of you who know a little bit of ancient history know that it spread all the way to the Balkan region, to what's now Romania, and especially to the west and north in Europe, to Great Britain, and of course, all the language, what are now the modern countries that speak derivatives of Latin, things like Spanish, Portuguese, French, Italian. And that was, these guys did that. They took the language with them and basically locally imposed it on the populace of each of these regions. And in so doing, accumulated new words from the local languages, so that and new pronunciations, and thus Latin evolved away from the classical form in those areas. So the Roman Empire, here they are marching into Switzerland or something. And of course, which enduring all the way to the present is the Roman Catholic Church. And until fairly recently, the language of their liturgy and formal communications was Latin. And in fact, there is a contingent of folks in the Vatican that speak Latin to one another because it's the common language in which they are all conversant, since they come from all over the world. All right, so next, please. Well, the result of these these factors of the last two slides is that the people of the clergy and associated people of the church, as well as medical doctors and a small quantity of the local politicians, and nobility, were the literate class, and many of the languages of the late that the Romans encountered in the late part of their empire, roughly the 6th century, 6th to 7th century, it didn't have a written form of their language. So Latin became the written language that was the common language throughout much of Europe and somewhat beyond. And here you have some scribes depicted in a kind of a interesting form with reading and transcribing and so on. Important jobs because there was no printing presses back then. They had to transcribe things by hand. Next, please. And I just want to mention that a lot of the nomenclature in biology and in botany in particular comes to us from Greek. And this is the Roman scholars could at least read Greek, and many of them had studied in Greece and learned Greek. And so a lot of Greek terms entered their technical vocabulary. And we'll see these two terms a little bit later on, but just as an example, the Latin word for leaf was folium, and the Greek word for leaf was phylum, Phyllum. And don't ever pronounce that phylum, or I'll slap you with a wet noodle or something. So, but anyway, we'll see those two words again. But folium versus phylum, and both of these words are active in botanical Latin names. So this is an old Greek manuscript, very in some curious old-fashioned handwriting that doesn't look much like modern Greek, if you're familiar with that, but nonetheless, it is Greek. So on we go. Next. And then, so in the 1700s, there was this fellow, a brilliant guy, a brilliant naturalist called Carl von Linné, also more commonly known as Carolus Linnaeus, which was his Latinized name. And he knew Latin by virtue of his father. Well, for one thing, they were out of the medieval time and into the early Enlightenment period, and more people were getting educated. But also, his father was a Lutheran minister and highly educated himself, and he taught his son all about Latin and plants. So, the subjects of the day. Linnaeus trained formally to become a physician, and there wasn't a lot of difference at that time between becoming a medical doctor and becoming a botanist, because, as I say, most of the medicines then were still actually derived from natural sources, typically plants. And so they were intimately connected in a way that in this modern era of synthetic chemistry, we don't appreciate that connection so much. So here we have a picture of Linnaeus, a fictional picture of Linnaeus beside a document indicating leaf shapes. And I just mentioned there's a term in botanical Latin for each of these different leaf shapes. And so, and that's what we're going to see as we go through this, that there tend to be this multiplication of terminology for the same item, the same organ of a plant, according to how it's formed, how it's built. And but you can kind of tell that the slide doesn't show it very well because it lost something in translation getting into this program. But you might notice that the column on the right has mostly English words in it. And I'm not sure Linnaeus actually knew English, but that's all right. But I do want to say here that much of our English terminology regarding plant structures is actually almost straight out of Latin or Greek, and pretty similar in form, usually differing in the ending. And we'll talk a little bit about endings as we go along here. So next. Yeah, so Linnaeus actually gave us a wonderful system for naming and classifying plants. And I thought it was amusing that when I was looking for a nice picture of his title page, I happened to find this sour ale that also is called Systema Naturae. But anyway, here's the frontispiece of Linnaeus's book. The very top, it says Caroli Linnaei. This means Carol or Carl Linnaeus's. That's the possessive form of his name. And then the system of nature, naturae. It means of nature. The simple form, the nature, would just end in A. So this is a tricky part. It kind of points to a tricky part of Latin for us, is that Latin had this a vast array of endings, of which we have some remnants in our English pronouns, but not in any other nouns. And so it becomes kind of daunting to look at Latin and figure out the relationships of the words which these endings actually indicate. In fact, in classical Latin texts, they had prepositions, but they didn't use them a lot because the endings of the nouns that were close together actually indicated which belonged to which other and in what manner. So if you follow me there. But you'll notice we'll see this kind of as we go along here. In the middle of the page there, it says Regna Tria Naturae. This means the three kingdoms of nature, and they're broken down into classes, orders, genera, and species. And we'll see those words again in clearer print as we go along. Next. So this is kind of a funny thing. I've got this magnificent book, William T. Stearns' Botanical Latin. It's let's see, I'd have to look up how many pages are in it, but it's thick and heavy, and it's basically a full treatment of the Latin language as it is used in botany. We're going to focus on Latin names today, or I am going to focus on Latin names today rather than in the full gamut of botanical formal descriptions of species and all of that stuff. So I would note that this book is really basically a whole Latin course. And I just remind you that, as we kind of saw in the first slide, Botanical was a real living language with tens of thousands at least of words. And we are barely going to scratch the surface of this language today. But I tried to bring up some fairly salient points about it. I thought this quote from from the beginning of Stearns' book was kind of funny. Botanical Latin is a very special kind of Latin, a strange, barbarous place for classicists. And by that he means that if you are a student of the classical Latin language, the famous writings of the few centuries before and after the Common Era, those classical writers would hardly recognize what's going on in Botanical Latin. I mean, they could figure it out, but it'd be like just this strange, jargony kind of scary place. I like the adjective barbarous. That's sort of fun. But anyway, Stearns' book is not for beginners. I don't recommend it to you unless you really want to dive into this topic. Next. So Linnaeus' system, coming back to that, it was a hierarchical system, as we've already seen, and we'll look at that, we'll review that below. But this slide also demonstrates a little bit of why Latin is scary to us. So the largest groups in the three kingdoms were each was called a regnum, and the plural of that is regna. So now, if you know Spanish or Italian or something derived from Latin, you might think of words ending in a as feminine words. But in this case, it was also the plural ending of a lot of neuter gender nouns. Now, the neuter gender did not survive to the modern era. Everything became either masculine or feminine in modern Latin. But that's still complicated for us because aside, again, from pronouns like we have, he, she, and his, hers, and so on, but in the whole rest of our noun system, we don't retain gender as a working phenomenon. Although we do refer to ships as she, and a few little old-fashioned relics like that. Anyway, the three kingdoms were the lapides, which is the rocks, and I just point to the fact that the singular of that was lapis. So where does that D come in for, to make the plural? Well, rocks are not a biological thing, as we know, but the animals and animalia and the plants, plantae, are, of course, living creatures, and we now have many more kingdoms than these three. Including fungi and a variety of things that we refer to as algae, particularly in marine systems. And so the system has become much more complicated. But anything that used to be called a plant, and most outstanding among these would be the fungi, the mushrooms and the lichens and so on. These have, as we'll see a little bit later on, the same endings for the higher classification as the plants, particularly the family name. So anyway, you might have heard of these referred to as the animal, vegetable, and mineral kingdoms back when you were a school kid. I know I did. Is that still current? You can let me know in the chat. Anyway, below these highest groupings, the kingdoms, were only 4 levels of classification: classes, orders, and here's another weird plural and singular divergence. And here the next one's even weirder: genus and genera, or genus, genera, as they were said in Latin. And species, in which the singular and plural are identical. So how do you keep track of all these endings and stuff? So that's why I mentioned that that Latin is a little bit scary to us in English with our not very highly inflected language. We're just not used to all these endings and how they relate words to one another. But yeah. This is difficult even for people who speak like Spanish or Italian or other languages that are clearly closely related to Latin. They aren't used to this either, because a lot of these endings died throughout history. All right, we can go to the next slide. So a really important category that was added later on, and it was the family category. And we use this a lot. We talk about the Asteraceae or any one of a wide variety of other plant families as sort of the everyday higher category that includes closely related genera, genuses, as some people like to say. And I don't really object to that, by the way, because I get it. It's hard to keep track of these crazy Latin plurals. But so if you anglicize them, and say funguses instead of fungi, I'm certainly not going to get upset about it. But all of these families, well, almost all of them, end in this ACEAE, and there's some variation on how these are pronounced. It's got too darn many vowels, and how do they all get pronounced? The standard, you might say, for English-speaking speakers of Botanical Latin or those speaking about the plant families is to pronounce it ACE, and as in the spelling of the word ace, ACE. So you can think of it as a band name, Fab ACE. It would be the Bean family. There is a band called that, right? I don't know. You can answer that in the chat too. I think I heard of one. Anyway, we also know there's also the version ACA, and I will not quibble with you if you say it that way. I really will be surprised if people start using the classical Latin pronunciation of this ending, which is AKI. And it doesn't look like that to us because it just doesn't. Anyway, next. Okay, there are these exceptions in plant taxonomy. There are 8 families that have alternate valid names that don't conform to this ending in the ACE ending. You might be familiar with some of these names, like the umbelliferae, and that's the carrot family or the umbels, and we all know that they have this structure of flowers that's sort of umbrella-like. The palms, palmy, that's pretty obvious. The composites, that's also a common name in English for the aster daisy thistle dandelion family, the composites. And the compositae, or compositae as we say in English, is this refers to the fact that what looks like a flower in this family is actually a compound flower. It's multiple flowers all stuck close together on a common receptacle. And so they are said to have composite flowers. There are a few other family that have kind of a similar arrangement, like the teasel family and so on, but it's kind of an unusual arrangement. There are mints that have closely packed flowers in a bunch, like the mountain mint group, and but they differ in how the technical details of how the flowers actually attach to the top of the stems. So they aren't composites, even though it looks kind of like they might be. The next one are the what we in modern taxonomy refer to as the Brassicaceae, also perfectly validly referred to as cruciferae, the crucifers. This means, by the way, the cross bearers. The cruc part, the CRUC, means cross, and when you see names that have fer in them, that usually means it bears or carries or has upon it these something in a cross shape. So the reference here is that the mustards typically have 4-petaled flowers in kind of a cross shape. So there we go. Clusiaceae, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this family name, but the old name Gutiferae is conserved as an equal status family name. And Gutiferae, there's that ending ferae again, so it's carrying something on it, and Gutiferae means it has droplets on it. If you look at the leaves of this family, which are the let me think now. What's hypericum called in English? I sometimes search for an English name for these things. It'll come to me. St. John's wort. The St. John's wort family has little dots on the leaves that look like tiny droplets. And sometimes they're whitish, sometimes they're blackish, but it has these droplet-looking structures on the surface. So it's the droplet-bearing family. Fabaceae, which we've already met, that fictitious band name, are also called the leguminosae, the leguminous ones, the ones that have legumes as their characteristic fruit. So what's a legume? Think of a bean or a pea pod. That is a legume. Lamiaceae are the mints, and they can also be called the labiatae. Lamiaceae actually is just named for the oldest known genus, which is the Lamium amplexicale and Lamium. They're out in your yard getting ready to flower right now. It's a really early flowering annual mint, and once again I'm blanking on the name, but it'll come to me later. But anyway, the mint family is also known as the labiatae, which means the lipped ones, those which have lips. Henbit, thank you, somebody said noted the proper name for lamium. I appreciate that help. Anyway, the labiatae have flowers with distinct upper and lower lips that are formed from fused petals, so that they are the lip flowers. And finally, the Poaceae, named after the genus Poa, which is the bluegrass genus, also can be called Gramineae, and that just refers to the classical word for grasses. Okay, so we kind of spent a lot of time on this slide, but I wanted to, so go through and give you the meanings of these words, because I want you to learn a little bit of Latin as we go along. Next. Okay, so let's talk about species names now that we've conquered the family level, more or less. Species names always have two parts. Now, once in a great while, you'll see a plant name that has three parts, either a third word or something called a var or a variety name, but we're not going to talk about that. Those are smaller categories than the species level. They're variants within a species. Okay, but the two-part species name has a particular form. It's always a capitalized noun. So anytime you see a plant name, a Latin name, the first element should be capitalized. And these nouns, as we kind of hit on before, in Latin could be either masculine, feminine, or neuter. And that was also true in classical Greek, by the way. And we'll see some examples, actually we already have in some of the words that we've seen, where it's not easy to know what the gender of a noun is. It's one of these things you kind of memorize in your Latin class. So it's often easier to tell what the grammatical gender is by looking at the specific epithet, the second part. And properly, the specific epithet should never be capitalized. I see people write both parts of the species name capitalized, but that is not the convention of biological nomenclature. In zoology, which I'll just digress for a minute since I'm a zoologist, really, just kind of amateur plant guy. But anyway, in zoology, they used to have, well, botany too, certain types of specific epithets used to be capitalized, but now both the Code of Zoological and the Code of Botanical Nomenclature now agree that the specific epithet should never be capitalized. So I tell you, people sometimes mistake this and capitalize both words, and I've even seen it in a journal, which just is shocking to me because I have this kind of traditional training. Anyway, this is kind of a fun thing. The specific epithet can be either an adjective or a noun. If it's an adjective, it has to agree in gender with the genus name. And so, for example, you might have let's look at the Latin word album, which means white. Albus is masculine. Alba is feminine. Album is neuter. And those are the forms that would naturally follow the genus names of whatever gender it might be. So we'll kind of see an example or two of those as we go along. If the specific epithet is a noun, it's referred to as a noun in apposition. And we have something like that in English. The noun in apposition actually comes before the other noun that it defines. So, for example, a chocolate milkshake. It's chocolate and milkshake are both nouns in that term, and we all, But in Latin, the thing about the nouns in apposition that are used as specific epithets is that they never change in form. So they're going to stay the same no matter what happens to the genus. And the thing that is happening a lot nowadays that people kind of grumble about is that sometimes a plant gets reclassified to a different genus. And when that happens, it may have a different gender. For example, those of you who are familiar with the asters might have seen this happen because there's so many asters and we know the names of some of them. Aster was masculine. And so the adjectives that went with them usually ended in us, the masculine ending, us. But the American asters have been separated off into this multisyllabic name, Symphyotrichum or Symphyotricum, as you prefer. And that's a neuter noun, so all the specific epithets had to change to agree. Yeah, well, we won't dwell on this last question about why these names change, but usually it's a good scientific reason. Let's just say that out of generosity. Okay, and we can move on now to the next slide. Okay, so here's some examples that tell us various things. I'll start in the upper right, first of all, white sweet clover, Melilotus albus, or Melilotus albus, as most people say. This is white sweet clover. Melilotus is a masculine noun, so it takes a masculine adjective form to follow it. To the left of that is Quercus alba. Now, what's going on there? That Quercus looks like a masculine noun with that us ending. Well, the trick here is that almost all the classical names for trees were feminine in Latin, even though they looked like they were masculine. So this is what I mean. Unless you grew up speaking Latin, how would you know this stuff? And anyway, so Quercus, the white oak, has to have this feminine form, alba. Okay, and finally, on the gender thing, we have what most people in the audience would refer to as Acer rubrum, the red maple. And Acer is a a neuter noun, again, with this, it's not easily recognizable as such by its ending. Usually nouns that end in ER are masculine, so what the heck. But anyway, and it's just weird because it's a tree genus, and instead of being feminine like all the others are, it's neuter, so crazy stuff. So anyway, I'm really trying to saturate you with the scariness of Latin noun and adjective agreement. But here's one that's easy. So here we have Diosporos, the persimmon genus, and it's feminine like the other classical tree genera. But this one has the species name, the specific epithet kaki, which is a Japanese noun for persimmon. And it always stays the same. You don't have to say kakius or kakium or kakia. It's always kaki because it's a noun and it's unchanging in its gender. So, okay, that's enough of that slide. I think you got the idea here. Okay, so we're going to go on to some more vocabulary, and I just want to reiterate that we are barely scratching the surface here. I'm not. You're not going to go away from here speaking in full sentences in Latin. We're just going to try and give you enough of an introduction so you won't be quite so daunted by it. Okay, so names of plant species are often based on their physical features. And foremost among these are leaf shape, hairiness characters. There's all kinds of, there's pubescent, there's spiny, there are, a variety of things. Flower color, number of petals, and things that you're pretty familiar with when you are looking at plants. And in fact, some people only look at the flowers and that's one of my pet peeves is wildflower books that just show you a flower picture and don't include any leaves. So just saying, they're not very useful, so don't waste your money on them. Anyway, names may also tell you about where the plant was first found or what its geographic range in the larger scheme of things is. And sometimes the name is given in error, and that's a kind of a funny one. This name, Simonsia chinensis, is the Latin name of a plant that is native to Arizona and surrounding the deserts of surrounding states. And we know it as jojoba because jojoba oil is used in skin products and some other uses. And but here's this name. Simonsia was named for whoever Simmons was, I guess, an early discoverer of the plant. And chinensis, as you might guess, means from China. And I'll just say that ensis, this ending ensis or ense in the neuter form, and always pronounce that final vowel, even if it looks like it should be just chinense. Say chinense, or chinensi at least. And anyway, this ending has evolved into the modern English ease, as in Chinese or Japanese or whatever. Okay, names can talk about their habitat. A lot of times, especially when you go to other continents, the names for the species, or sometimes even a genus, may take up something from a local language. And we've already seen the example of the kaki for the Japanese persimmon. Yeah, and I see a comment here about favorite location is Canadensis from Canada, and I don't know if the commenter is Canadian and loves it for that reason, or because we have so many plants in our flora that are called Canadensis. And well, in the early days of North American plant taxonomy, geographic perceptions were different. Let's just say that. Or it's possible that the plant was first found in Canada, in places more or less adjacent to the United States. Um, and finally, names can be honorific, and they're named for someone. So we're going to go through some examples of this as we go through, and in slides that are less texty and more colorful. So next slide, please. All right, so this is a little science facts chart of leaf shapes. And the names for these leaf shapes, linear, ovate, elliptical, oblong, cordate, etc., are not in their Latin form. These are the English form. And a lot of times you might know some of these words, at least linear and ovate and elliptical. But the Latin form is pretty easy to figure out. I mean, it's pretty easy to recognize the meaning of the Latin form. So it's linearis or ovatus or ellipticalis or oblongus, and you just look at the beginning of it, kind of ignore that ending, and you know what the meaning of it is. Now, sometimes it's a little more obscure, cordate. We don't necessarily, you start thinking about, a woven cord of string or something. It actually refers to the shape of the heart shape. And, I don't know, since you live around here, oops, we jumped ahead and I wasn't quite ready for that. So if we can go back, that would help. Or I'll just say it. We don't have to go back. We can stick here. Yeah, so cordate shows up in the name of the town Crèvepeur, which is, but that's the French version of it, so it doesn't look like C-O-R-D anymore. But anyway, yeah, so we had all these shapes, variety of shapes of simple leaves, or simplex, and again, that's pretty recognizable. But pinnate and palmate versions of these leaves. These are leaves, actually, this is a single leaf here in the middle, and that is divided into leaflets. And in this case, it's an odd number of leaflets. You can also have even pinnate leaves with, in this case, there would be only 10 leaflets instead of 11. And then palmate has the shape of a palm or your hands your fingers spread apart. But I just want to reiterate, these two things on the right hand, two illustrations, are actually single leaves that are divided into parts. Called leaflets. And we know this because a true leaf has a bud at the base of it and leaflets never do. So, and sometimes you have to look really close to determine that, but anyway, that's true. I guess we can move along. Next slide, please. Okay. Flower structures are super important in plant names. And so this begins to demonstrate that you really kind of have to teach yourself or take a class in botany to kind of get all this vocabulary into your head. And like I say, some of these can be identical in form in Latin and English, or they can be a little bit different in ending. So like stigma, if you look at the female part on the left-hand side, stigma is the same in English. Style becomes stylus with a US at the end. Ovary and so on are not quite matching the Latin form. And then egg, of course, is just pure English, for which the Latin would be ovum, or the Greek would be o, oon, o is the root. The receptacle is the base underneath the flower through which all the vascular tissue, the veins that supply the sap to the flower, branch out and diversify into the various flower structures. Peduncle is the name of the flower stalk, and so now here comes some more familiar stuff. There are petals that are the brightly colored parts. Sepals usually aren't, but they can also be brightly colored, and they occur in a ring beneath the petals on the stalk, and then below them is the peduncle. Okay, I'm gonna have to pick it up here a little bit because I think I'm running a little long. I enjoy talking about this stuff. Next slide, please. Yeah, there's a question about commenting on the difference between peduncle and petiole, and that's actually really easy. The peduncle is the stalk of a flower, and the petiole is the stalk of a leaf. So anyway, here's a color wheel, which in the production of this slide I stretched out into a color ovoid or ellipse because I wanted to make it fit on the rectangular shape better. And then what I've done around the circle is near each slice of the pie, giving you some Latin terms for colors. And there's a nice array of them. Some of them, for example, if you go up to the reds at the top right, you have rudrot and rubra and eryth. These are actually all words for the color. But at the end, that sanguine thing, you might recognize that term, that refers to blood, so it's blood red. And you have sort of the same thing with some of these other ones where there's actually a name of the color per se, or there's a name based on something that has that color. So in orange, for example, you have that persic thing at the bottom. That's the root of the word for peach, which is kind of orange in color, and so on around the wheel. So there are lots of, there were lots of things in the classical world that were reddish or purplish, and blue, on the other hand, was kind of rare in in nature, but plants were kind of the exception there in having blue and bluish purple flowers and so on. So there's a few words out there. You might notice for purple you have purpur and porphyr. These are again the Latin and the Greek forms of what's actually historically the same word. So yeah, we run into that. And let's see, are there anything else to say about this? Nothing, just that there's a whole lot of flower words and they get involved. And I just put a little box on the right-hand side here talking about some things that aren't on the wheel, so specifically white and silver colored and gray, black, and brown, and a few words that are used in botany for those. Next. Okay, here we're gonna get a little bit technical, but I won't dwell on it. I just want to say, if you start identifying plants from technical descriptions or plant or keys to species or genera or whatever, a lot of times they'll ask you to look at the hairs under magnification and describe their shape. And I'm not going to go through all these, but I would just mention again that, you know, some of these words actually are just glandular. That's a Latin word. Stellate, that's a Latin word. So we just simplify the ending, but the Latin form of it is recognizable by having a whole bunch of letters, most of the letters in common. And then there's some sort of technical things like up there, the glandular things. There's hydrophilic and lipophilic, and you might know those if you've had chemistry or medical training, but those are, some of them are a little bit more obscure. So I think that's enough on that point. In fact, there may be another useful diagram. There's some more plant hairs. And one of the things it's showing you here is that sometimes they have more than one cell in them, the plant hairs, and other times they're just a single hair, a single cell that's even one that's branched. And just mention this as a Spanish, this comes out of a Spanish document. So we would write this squamiform instead of esquamiforme. So anyway, there you go. Next. Okay, some geographic epithets that are used for Missouri plants. Common ones, Americanus canadensis, we've already kind of talked about. There's a bunch of state names, and this usually refers to the place where the plant was first discovered and or recognized, and you know, and then later on it was realized that it occurs in Missouri and a lot of other places throughout a surrounding region of Texas. Of course, the Missouriensis and Missouriense and Missouricus and so on, these are all pretty easy to recognize. I would point out to you, though, that it's a little confusing because Missouri, this could refer to what we think of as the state of Missouri, or it could refer to the entire Missouri River drainage. So sometimes there are plants called Missouriensis or Missouricus that actually don't even live in Missouri. They live upstream, you know, over there by the Rocky Mountains where the Missouri originates. So that can be just a little confusing. Ozarkanus doesn't need any explanation. And then we do have some non-native plants here in Missouri that have endings that refer to other parts of the world. And again, pretty easy to recognize. Chinensis, Andinus, and so on. They're kind of recognizable where they come from. Okay, next. There is a question I'll just take right now about what decides the gender of these things. Is it biological, as it suggests, or is it more complicated? And the simple answer to that question is yes, all of the above. It is more complicated. There's a classical gender for every noun, and sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes there are two different words for the same thing in Latin, and one is feminine, one's masculine, so it doesn't have anything to do with biological gender. It's just the origin of the word. So it's a little arbitrary, and as I say, not always recognizable. Names indicating habitat are, again, sometimes pretty obvious. And, you know, prairius means prairie and so on. This one's a little bit atypical. Officinalis really refers specifically to area of a doctor's office. And so it's actually kind of an alternate term for a medicinal plant. And so on, these other ones. Lacustris is a little obscure. The lek part is the only thing that reminds us of a lake. But, you know, it's in there if you kind of look at it real hard. Next slide. Okay, and then there's some less obvious habitat descriptions. And, you know, I like this one a lot, pratincola. It means of the meadows, or of, you could think of it as of prairies. And it has this ending cola, which, by the way, can be any gender, even though this is an adjective. So there's a few adjectives that are non-invariant in their ending too, but yeah, that's a kind of a technicality. And so, but yeah, sandy places in water and so on. These are less commonly used in names of plants, but they might not be so easily recognized. But here's a lovely sylvatic fire managed woodland. And with that, we'll go on next. And just yeah, okay. There's a good question there about who gets to decide names, and basically the short answer is botanists who are describing the species. They get to decide. And if you have more questions about that, we can bring it up later. Anyway, here we have an array of plants. We have rupestral plants that are growing on these rocks, sylvatic plants in the woods, and so on, riparian, and even some amphibious ones. This one can grow in or out of water as long as the soil is reliably wet. So they're just kind of a practical application of some of this terminology. Next, please. And then there are honorific names, and we have genus names, Tradescantia, named after a couple of English botanists, and Zizia, named after a German botanist whose name was Johann Sitz. And this picture, I just got to, you know, wave my own flag a little bit here. This is from my the prairie planting in my backyard. So, and I love, which I love very much. Anyway, next. Honorifics can be used as specific names too. Here's a couple of genuine Missouri Prairie Foundation members, who some of you may know. The feminine one would have, if she had a plant named after her, and these are fictitious, I say, would be Tragerii with the AE at the end, and if it was a masculine, it'd be Tragerii. That's the way people usually say them. If the plant were named for both of us, it might be called something Trageriorum, meaning of the Tragers. So that's that. But yeah, that's me and Jan Trager, by the way, in case you didn't recognize us. Next slide, please. Okay, so I showed you the book that's not for beginners, but this is a super useful little book with lots of both plant and animal scientific terminology as it's used in descriptions and in their Latin names. And I recommend this one to you. It's out of print, but still available in used book circles. And if you want to get into this in depth, I would say get this book. The Donald J. Borer, he was an entomologist, by the way, another guy with fondness for this classical language, and the Dictionary of Word Roots and Combining Forms. Next slide, please. Okay, so when I was preparing this thing, I found this a little meme on Twitter, actually, that somebody posted. The fact that some people can't distinguish between etymology and entomology bugs me in ways I can't put into words. So that's a play on the meanings of these two words, in case you didn't get that. But I thought it was kind of funny. I really appreciate your paying attention for this somewhat long period of time. I guess I ran long, but I am available for questions for the next little while, and I'm sorry for just not knowing how long it takes me to say things. So, but thank you much for your attention. I think that Haley's going to report questions to me, so I'll take that.
Can you hear me?
We can. I can.
Perfect. Well, I just want to say thank you so much. I have my work cut out for me in learning how to advance slides properly, and B, learning some more Botanical Latin. So thanks for your patience. It's not an easy job. So.
I will say that we all have that lying before us. I have been doing this for 40 years, and there's a lot of Latin I don't know.
Well, I did, just before I get to the questions there, you have answered some kind of as you've gone, which I thought was really nice. But I just wondered if you had a resource where people could go if they are looking to hear the correct pronunciation of possibly, their favorite native plants. Is there a resource out there that you know of?
Well, there are various resources, and okay, so there's classical Latin pronunciation, which you would learn in a Latin course, an actual classical Latin course. There's also descriptions of sort of standard British English renditions of how to pronounce these things. And the American versions are somewhat close to those. But we have a real problem in English in that our vowels have diverged so much into different forms. So, for example, the letter A, which can be or 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 a, all those, several different sounds. And people don't know, what to do with them all. I think one rule of thumb that's a pretty good one is in the California flora, the standard California flora, there's a rule that all the names should be pronounced rather accented on the penultimate syllable. In other words, the next to the last one, and vowels should be always pronounced in the standard a, e, I, o, u, or a, e, I, o, u form rather than the English form. But that's, nobody really follows that. Well, maybe a few people trained by the authors of the Flora of California do. By the way, I wanted to show you, let's see if I can get this to show on the screen. It's backwards, I think, as you see it, because it's coming through my flower. But this is Door County's wildflowers. Is that legible? It's a field guide to the, and this, you can learn a lot of Botanical Latin from this book, because the first paragraph of every species talks about the derivation of the English and the Latin names. And they're mostly pretty accurate. So for example, Bethany, it tells you it comes from a Latin word that came into English meaning an herb, and its genus name Pedicularis means it refers to lice, because it used to be thought of as a that animals grazing on it would get lice. So, so pedicularis. Anyway,
All right.
So those are, I mean, there's a lot of places out there where you can get this. Um, if you really want to get into it, the Stearns book that I showed earlier is, wow. I mean, you can learn a lot pouring through that thing, but it's a heavy tome, and it really, I just don't recommend it for you as a starting point.
All right. Thank you. We had a question from Chris, and he wanted to know why hyphens are sometimes used, such as in the species name for I'm going to slaughter this, Cyphotrichium nova angeli.
Ah, yes, Nova Angli. Okay. Well, so I think that Symphyiotrichum Nova Angli is the New England aster, for those of you who aren't caught up on that one. It's Nova Angli means of New England, which is two words. And in Latin, it's Nova Anglia or Anglia Nova. It can be either way. But anyway, the hyphen just tells you that it's two separate words. Sometimes people just drop that out, and you see names that don't include it. Don't include the hyphen, and I think that that's I don't know. It goes back to what the original author did when they described the species.
Okay, thank you.
I would just let me add one little thing to that. The original author's spelling, even if it was in error, or if the name didn't make any sense, like Chinensis for that plant from Arizona, we're stuck with those names if they were printed with the original description and were the original oldest name that was ever given to that plant. So even where there were mistakes or there's variations in the way stuff gets spelled, we're stuck with it.
Okay. Well, this is more of a comment, I guess, but James said that he really enjoyed if this is a 101 version of this course, would you be willing to do a 102 version?
Oh my God, do I have to? Probably a good way to do that, if you're in the St. Louis area, is to come along on one of my wildflower walks at Shaw Nature Reserve that I give, a few times a month in the spring and fall, and once a month in the in the summers. So.
Well, yeah, we'd love for you to maybe share those dates with us so that we could, let people know.
Yeah, I think I can send that to you electronically. I'll work on that.
Thank you.
And don't fail to remind me, because I've got other things that I'm moving on to, but I can do it pretty quickly if I get the reminder.
No worries. All right. The next question is from Judy, and she wanted to know, and this is kind of tied into what I was asking. She wanted to know of any audio resources that you know of that
boy,
you could use as a teaching tool or learning tool.
Oh, I see a useful comment here, by the way. There are recordings of Glenn Kopp, who used to work at the garden, the Kemper Center, as manager of the Kemper Center. He recorded his pronunciation of the plant names on Mobot Finder web pages, which have a lot of different plants on them. And I don't know, like I say, people vary in how classical they want to be, or how anglicizing they want to be in their pronunciations. And I haven't listened to any of Glenn's pronunciations, but I do know he's a pretty fastidious, punctilious kind of guy, and I bet you he pronounces every syllable and every vowel. So
great. We'll get that resource added in our follow-up email.
There you go.
Let's see. And from Gary, can you see Gary's question about Linnaeus named common milkweed, Asclepias. Did I say that right?
Yeah. Oh, here it is, Gary Shackelford. Okay. He named common milkweed Asclepias syriaca. Oh, because the box in which the specimen was packaged when it was shipped to Sweden was mislabeled as having come from Syria. Well, I've heard various stories about this. One of the alternative explanations is that the common milkweed that we know around here was an introduced species and already moderately widespread in parts of the Middle East and Mediterranean region. So there's that. I honestly don't know, Gary, if which is true and if there is yet another explanation that's the real truth. So I'd have to research that. I'm sorry to say. I don't have a good answer for you.
All right, and then the last Q&A that I see was from Catherine, and she wanted to know if you can speak a little bit, which I think you did a little bit, about the renaming of plants.
Oh boy, okay.
Yeah.
Well, all right. So this is the result of what's known as research into plant systematics. And plant systematics takes into account, often the original descriptions of plants were fairly superficial. And when more modern botanists have gone back and looked at these plants, they've looked at them with better lights and better microscopes and other tools, such as genome information and so on, and other plant chemistry stuff. And they find out that plants that kind of look like they were closely related actually aren't. And so that results in the plant being shifted over to another genus where its true relatives, according to this greater quantity of information, are located. So the specific question was about a Gomphocarpus, Physocarpus, and I'm not actually sure where it lies today. Is it in Asclepias maybe? But anyway, somebody found out that it was separated out in this other group, but actually in the evolutionary tree, it lies right there in the middle of Asclepias. So it gets moved over there because that's where it more properly belongs in evolutionary terms.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that helped. Yeah, a lot of it has to do with better information that we have today.
Okay. And Chris just added another question, and he wanted to know, what do you do when an organization doesn't accept the renaming of a genus or species?
Oh boy, well, this happens, and you see this. For example, in Missouri, we pretty much tried to keep up with all the, we have Missouri Botanical Garden here, and, any kind of study that comes out of there, it gets respected. And as far as if, name changes and so on. And they're not just name changes, as I say, they're classificational changes. So it's not just somebody fiddling around and saying, oh, I think this belongs here. It's based on a lot of evidence. But anyway, oh gosh, I lost my train of thought. This is Catherine's, no, Chris.
This is again. Chris's.
Oh yeah, an organization. Yeah, but by contrast, I noticed a lot of publications from Illinois. Not so much the new big one from the Chicago area, Flora, but some of the less formal publications, the wildflower guides and such, are still using names that I learned 30 years ago, even when a minority of those, but a significant one, are have been changed. So, this happens. But even among experts, there's judgment calls, if you will, based on some of these things. And I know that you get this grumbling. Like right now, there's this big discussion going on about whether the dogwood genus should be divided up into 4 separate genera. And then there are other people who are arguing that Symphotrichum should be stuck back into aster, really. And this stuff goes on, and it's a little hard to keep up with, and it makes us mere mortals out here in amateur botany land kind of get frustrated. So I sympathize, Chris. It's sometimes you don't know why it gets done that way, and there are things that get moved out of a genus like the Solidago, the goldenrod genus, and then get put back into it, and like, wait, what happened there? So.
Well, I think that was the end of the questions that were in the Q&A. I'll make sure and go back through the chat, and after this is over, and if there are any other questions within there, I'll make sure and get those to you. But I think that is going to be a wrap for tonight. As I mentioned before, this webinar is being recorded, and an email will be sent out to all the registrants tomorrow with a webinar link and other resources that were mentioned during the webinar. We want to thank James, and maybe we could do a part 2 or 102 down the road sometime. We'll see. But if you enjoyed this presentation, we do hope that you'll attend our next webinar, which is a Grow Native webinar entitled Gardens of Excellence, and that's on March 15th. And then we have another masterclass coming up with Scott Woodbury called the Prairie Garden Primer for Town and Country, which is on Wednesday, March 29th. So again, thank you so much, James, and thanks to everyone who attended today and hung on till the end. We hope that you have a great evening.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for your attention. It was fun.
Thank you.